Picture yourself waking up in a world where the cold bites harder than your worst winter day, where the sun's barely a rumor on the horizon, and your breath hangs in the air like a ghost. Your hands are already aching from yesterday's work, and there's no coffee to jolt you awake, no heater to chase away the chill. This, my friends, was the daily reality for medieval peasants, ordinary people whose lives were so raw, so relentless, that our toughest days would feel like a vacation to them. Welcome to Boring History, where we're diving into the gritty, fascinating world of how these folks survived the brutal winters of the Middle Ages. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll look at your cozy blanket and thermostat with a whole new appreciation. We're talking about Europe between the 5th and 15th centuries, a time of castles, knights, and tales of dragons whispered around flickering fires. But for about 90% of the population, life wasn't about epic quests or royal feasts. It was about staying alive. These were the peasants, the unsung heroes who kept the feudal world spinning. They didn't have electricity, indoor plumbing, or the luxury of ordering takeout when they were too tired to cook. Everything they had, they made, grew, or traded for. If you think your Monday grind is rough, imagine a life where every day is a full-body workout, no gym membership required. These people were tougher than the fittest influencer you follow, hauling water, chopping wood, and wrestling stubborn soil into submission. Now, don't get me wrong. Life was hard. Their homes were cramped, smoky huts. Their beds were piles of straw, and their meals were often just a bowl of watery soup. But here's what's wild. They didn't just wallow in misery. They were resourceful, clever, and downright stubborn in their will to survive. They carved tools from wood, patched walls with mud and manure, and turned scraps into meals that could last through the winter. They didn't have Amazon or YouTube tutorials, but they had ingenuity and a community that was tighter than any group chat you've ever been in. While we're scrolling through feeds, they were throwing communal feasts, sharing stories, and building bonds that made their villages feel like one big family. Winter, though, was the real test. When the days shrank and the cold sank into your bones, survival wasn't just a task. It was a battle. Without modern insulation or central heating, keeping warm was a constant struggle. Your house, if you could call it that, was a single room where you, your kids, and maybe a couple of chickens huddled together for warmth. The fire in the center was your lifeline, but it came with a price. Smoke that stung your eyes and sparks that could burn your whole world down if you weren't careful. Every day was a fight to stay warm, fed, and alive, and yet, these people didn't just endure, they found ways to thrive. Let's start with where this battle began. Their homes. A typical peasant house was about 400 square feet, smaller than most modern apartments, and built from whatever was lying around. Most were made with wattle-and-daub, a technique that sounds like something from a craft fair but was actually pretty genius. You'd weave sticks together like a giant basket, then smear on a mix of mud, straw, and, yes, animal manure. Once it dried, it was tough enough to last decades if you kept it up. The roof was thatched with straw, sometimes 2 feet thick, to keep out the snow and rain. But here's the kicker, no chimneys. The smoke from your fire had to snake its way through the thatch, so your choice was simple: freeze or choke. Not exactly the cozy vibe we dream of today. Inside, the floor was just packed dirt, covered with rushes, reeds, or straw to make it slightly less grim. They'd toss in herbs like lavender to mask the smell. But let's be honest. After months of living with animals and no proper sanitation, the place probably reeked like a barnyard. Furniture was sparse. A table, a few benches, maybe a chest for your handful of possessions. Beds? Most families slept on straw-filled sacks right on the floor, everyone piling together to share body heat. Imagine squeezing in with your parents, your siblings, and a stray goat for good measure. Cozy in a very medieval way. Keeping that house warm was a full-time job. Firewood was like gold. You had to gather it all year, because running out in January wasn't an option. Some lords were so controlling they'd fine you for collecting too much, as if staying warm was a crime. And that thatched roof? It needed constant patching. One bad storm could leave you with a soggy mess, and fixing it in the middle of a blizzard was nobody's idea of fun. But those houses weren't just shelters, they were a testament to grit. Archaeologists have found that well-maintained wattle-and-daub walls could last 50 years, which is pretty impressive for something made of mud and manure. What made these homes bearable was the community around them. Villages were built close together, often around a central green where kids played and animals grazed. Privacy? Not a thing. You could probably hear your neighbor arguing about whose turn it was to clean the pig pen. But that closeness was a lifeline. If your roof caved in, the whole village showed up to help, turning a repair job into a party with food and drink. It was like a medieval block party, except instead of burgers, you were passing around gritty bread and weak beer. These communal efforts weren't just about fixing things, they were about survival. In a world where one bad harvest could wipe you out, your neighbors were your insurance policy. Speaking of survival, let's talk about food. Because keeping your family fed through a medieval winter was no joke. Your daily diet was built around bread, 2 to 3 pounds of it every single day. But this wasn't the soft, crusty loaf you're picturing. It was coarse, sometimes mixed with sand from the millstones, which literally ground down your teeth over time. Your main drink was small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew that everyone, even kids, drank because water was often too dirty to trust. That's right, beer was the safer choice. Next time someone judges your happy hour, just tell them you're living like a 14th century peasant. For meals, you had pottage, a thick soup made from whatever you could find, peas, beans, maybe some onions or herbs if you were lucky. It was the ultimate leftover dish, simmering for days, sometimes weeks, as you tossed in new scraps. Meat was a rare luxury, maybe a few times a year during festivals. When you did get it, you used every bit, snout, tail, everything but the squeal, as they said. It was the original zero-waste movement, born out of necessity. And when it came to preserving food, peasants were absolute masters. They smoked, salted, and fermented everything from pork to cabbage, turning it into sauerkraut that could last through the winter. Some of these preserved foods were so tough that archaeologists still find them today, hard as rocks but perfectly preserved. The church made eating even trickier. They declared up to 150 days a year as fasting days, where you could only have one meal, and meat or dairy was often banned. They also had fish days. But if you lived inland, fish wasn't exactly on the menu. Instead, you might be chowing down on beaver tail or barnacle geese, which the church, in a stroke of creative genius, decided counted as fish. I mean, who looks at a goose and thinks, yup, that's seafood? But these rules pushed peasants to get inventive, making almond milk or mock eggs from ground nuts and spices, basically medieval vegan hacks that would fit right in at a modern health food store. Winter made food scarcity a real threat. A bad harvest could mean starvation, and skeletal remains show that kids often stopped growing during lean years, their bones marked with lines like tree rings. But when food was plentiful, peasants knew how to celebrate. Harvest festivals were massive, with everyone pitching in bread, beer, or maybe a sliver of bacon if times were good. These feasts weren't just about eating. They were about gratitude, about coming together to share what little you had. In a life of constant work, those moments of joy were like gold. That work, by the way, was relentless. If you think your 9 to 5 is a grind, try waking up at 4 a.m. in summer or 7 a.m. in winter, with no snooze button to save you. Peasants didn't have one job, they had all of them. Farmer, carpenter, shepherd, blacksmith, you name it, they did it. If you didn't know a skill, you learned it fast or your family went hungry. The agricultural calendar was their boss, and it was unforgiving. Spring meant plowing, guiding a heavy wooden plow pulled by oxen through stubborn soil. It took 8 oxen to plow 1 acre in a day. And losing one was like losing your car and your paycheck at the same time. Summer was weeding season, and trust me, it wasn't just pulling a few stray plants. A single patch of weeds could ruin your crop, so you were out there from dawn to dusk, back bent, hands blistered. But these folks weren't just laborers, they were innovators. They figured out crop rotation long before it had a name, planting wheat one year, barley the next, then letting the field rest to recover. They were like the original agricultural scientists, minus the fancy degrees. Fall was harvest time, a mad race against the weather to bring in the crops. Everyone in the village swung sickles, cutting grain in a rhythm that took 15, 000 swings to harvest 1 acre. By their 30s, most peasants had arthritis from the strain. Winter wasn't a vacation, either. You'd be fixing tools, patching fences, or trudging through snow to feed the animals. Indoors, you'd spin wool, make candles, or mend clothes. A never-ending DIY project with no tutorials to guide you. Threshing grain was the worst. Beating wheat with a stick for hours in a dusty barn. It was like the world's most miserable workout class. But here's the crazy part. Peasants got more days off than most of us. The church mandated about 150 holy days a year when work was forbidden. That's almost half the year, though you were probably still worrying about how to keep your family fed. What made all this bearable was the village. If your neighbor's barn burned down, you helped rebuild it. If their ox died, you lent yours, knowing they'd do the same for you. This wasn't just kindness, it was survival. Villages that worked together were more likely to survive famines or disasters. Some peasants even mastered specialized skills, like brewing or beekeeping, which gave them something to trade. A skilled blacksmith could hammer out 100 nails a day by hand. That's not just talent. That's next-level dedication. Now, all this work happened under the shadow of the feudal system, which was like being stuck in a contract you could never escape. From the day you were born, you owed your lord a chunk of everything, up to half your crops, sometimes even the first loaf of bread you baked. Some lords were so petty they'd fine you for picking up too much firewood or catching a rabbit on your own land. Everything belonged to them, even the fish in the stream. Want to move to another village? You needed permission. Want to marry someone from outside? That'll cost you a couple of chickens. One record from 1293 shows a peasant paying his lord 2 chickens just to let his daughter marry someone from the next village over. Talk about an expensive wedding. The manor court was where all this got sorted out, and trust me, it was a spectacle. Picture an outdoor gathering, with the lord or his steward playing judge over everything from stolen pigs to noisy neighbors. One guy got fined for brewing beer too loudly. Medieval noise complaints were real, but peasants weren't helpless. They could bring cases to court and often won, about 40% of the time when they challenged nobility. Women, too, could be plaintiffs, making up 15% of cases in some areas. Punishments were wild. Minor crimes might land you in the stocks, where your neighbors could chuck rotten veggies at you. For women labeled as scolds, there was the ducking stool, a medieval dunk tank that was anything but fun. One of the strangest parts of village life was the hue and cry system. If you saw a crime, you had to yell and chase the culprit, and everyone nearby was legally required to join in. Skip out? That's a fine about $50 in today's money. And don't even get me started on the animal laws. One court record shows a guy fined for letting his pig wander into the neighbor's garden. Some things really don't change, do they? If you think dealing with a nosy HOA sounds bad, try navigating medieval healthcare. If you hate going to the doctor now, you'd really hate it back then. Their medical knowledge was a mix of guesswork, superstition, and remedies that sound like something from a prank gone wrong. Got a headache? They drain a liter of your blood. Stomach ache? More bloodletting. Stubbed your toe? You guessed it, time for the leeches. They believed illnesses came from an imbalance of bodily fluids, so bleeding you was their fix-all. Some people got bled monthly, like it was a membership to good health. Spoiler, it wasn't. Peasants rarely saw trained doctors, though. They relied on local herbalists who actually knew a lot about plants. About 80% of their remedies had real medicinal value. Think willow bark for pain, basically natural aspirin. But the other 20%? Pure madness. Rubbing chicken poop on your head for baldness? No thanks. Kissing a donkey for a toothache? Hard pass. They'd tie dead moles to your head for headaches or carry a rotten potato for rheumatism. It was like a medieval version of a bad TikTok trend. But here's the wild part. Some of their treatments actually worked. Archaeologists have found skulls with healed holes from trepanning, brain surgery done with hand tools. The success rate was about 80%, which is insane when you consider they were drilling into skulls with no anesthesia. They used honey as an antiseptic, which science now confirms is effective. They even applied moldy bread to wounds, stumbling onto penicillin 800 years before it was discovered. And when it came to setting broken bones, some healers were so skilled that skeletons show perfectly healed fractures. The Black Death in 1348 was a nightmare of its own. Doctors wore creepy beak masks stuffed with herbs, which looked like something from a horror movie but actually had some antiseptic benefits. Too bad it didn't stop the plague. Towns made things worse by killing cats, thinking they spread the disease, only to let rats, the real culprits, run wild. One treatment involved strapping a live pigeon to your feet to draw out the sickness. It didn't work, but it probably made for some awkward bedside chats. They even thought red objects could cure fevers, so they'd wrap you in red blankets or make you stare at something red for hours. At least it was colorful. Despite all this, peasants weren't dropping dead left and right. If you survived childhood, you had a decent shot at hitting 60 or 70. About 10% of adults in medieval burial sites lived past 60. Not bad for a world where your doctor might suggest wearing a dead frog around your neck. Their resilience came from their lifestyle, constant work, a diet heavy on plants, and a community that had each other's backs. Maybe there was something to those weird remedies after all. So, what's the big picture here? Medieval peasants lived in a world that was cold, harsh, and unforgiving, but they didn't just scrape by. They built lives full of grit and ingenuity. They turned mud and straw into homes, scraps into meals, and backbreaking labor into a way of life. They leaned on their neighbors, outsmarted the seasons, and found joy in the smallest moments. A shared feast, a repaired roof, a rare day off. Their story isn't just about surviving the cold. It's about thriving against the odds, about finding strength in community and creativity in hardship. Next time you're shivering because your heater's acting up or grumbling about a long day, think about those peasants, huddled in their smoky huts, sharing a bowl of pottage, and gearing up for another freezing morning. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and somehow that was enough. Thanks for joining me on this chilly journey through the Middle Ages here on Boring History. If you loved this deep dive into peasant life, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Tell me, what part of this crazy world blew your mind the most? Was it the manure walls, the beaver tail dinners, or those wild medical treatments? Let me know, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay warm, folks, and maybe steer clear of kissing any donkeys.